All right, the next block we're going to build is this part of the page, which I call the domain block. So here we have a heading, some text, a search box, and the domain prices. We're not going to include the cards because these cards represent our plans. Plans and domain lookup are two completely different concepts, okay? So here's the standard version. On mobile, we're going to display these items or these domain prices like this. So back to our markup, we're going to start with a new section and give it two classes. The first one is block. The second one is container. So all of our content is constrained by 1140 pixels, okay? Now inside this section, we're going to have a header with a class of block _header. With this class, we can center align the heading and the paragraph. So in the header, we're going to have an H2 element, and here we can say starting at $9 per month. Then we're going to have a paragraph with 10 words. Good. Here's what we get. That looks pretty good, but we can customize it further if needed. Okay. Then we need to add an input group. So we pull up the template for our input groups and copy this entire code. Then paste it after the header. Let's see what we get. So that looks pretty good to me. One thing that is missing is the search icon. So let's pull up the template for the icon component. Now, in this case, we only want to grab the SVG. We don't want to put the icon on a circle with a background color. So let's copy this SVG and we're going to go to our button. We're going to paste that icon right before the label. Okay. Next, we should change the icon from WordPress to search and the class from icon primary to icon white. Let's see what we get. All right. The icon is way too big, but I got a question for you. Where is the right place to size this icon? Pause the video and think about it for a few seconds. It is possible that we're going to have many other buttons with icons. So we should define the size of an icon inside a button in the button section. So we want to make this something reusable. So here's the rule for the button class. Then we're going to define a new rule and say in the button, if you have an icon, the width of the icon should be, let's say 2 rams. The height should also be 2 rams. And we should give it a margin right of 1 ram. So the icon is separated from the label. Take a look. Okay, that's better. Now look at the position of this magnifying glass. Compare this with our design mockup. Do you see the difference? The magnifying glass is right in the middle of this line. But in our implementation, the magnifying glass and the label are bottom aligned. To solve this issue, we need to set vertical align to middle. Now take a look. Okay, that's perfect. Now, there are a couple of problems with the input box. The first problem is that our padding is a little bit off. It would be nicer if we had more horizontal padding. So let's see where this is coming from. Let's inspect this element. Here's our input group. Inside this input group, we have an input component. Now look at the padding we applied here. We are using 1.5 rams for vertical and 1 ram for horizontal. I don't know why I use 1 ram, it's not enough. So I'm going to change this to 2 ram. But where is this defined? On the line 290 of our style sheet. Back to VS Code. On the top, we go to the Go menu. Now look at the shortcut for Go to line. On Mac, it's Control and G. So let's quickly jump to line 290. Good. And then we're going to change the padding to 2 rams. Good. All right, that's better. Now, the next thing we should address is the shadow around this input group. Earlier, I told you that I didn't want to add the shadow to every input group because that would make our page really messy. So here we have 2 solutions. One solution is to apply the shadow to the instance of the input group in this block. The other solution is to define a utility class for adding shadows to different elements. With that solution, we can use that class in our markup like this. So here's our input group. Then we can add a class like box shadow. Now, the problem with that approach is that the more we use these utility classes, the more our markup starts to talk about styling. So we'll move away from semantic markup. Now, there are frameworks like Tailwind, which are based on this concept. These are called utility first or atomic CSS frameworks. In these frameworks, there are tons of utility classes like box shadow, border, font, text align, and so on. Some people love those frameworks, others hate them. In this course, we're not going to take that approach, so I'm not going to define a utility class here. Instead, I'm going to style this instance of the input group inside the block we're building. So let's give this block a specific class like block domain. Now, back to our style sheet, we define a new section called domain block. And here we define a new rule and say, in this block, the input group should have a box shadow of 0 and 0 for the offset, 30 pixels for blurring, 20 pixels for radius, and for the color, we're going to use E6, EB, EE. Okay? So here's the shadow, but we should remove the border. So let's set the border to 0. Okay, that's much closer to our design mockup, but we need more space between the input group and the text. Compare this with our design mockup. We have slightly more space here. So let's give this a margin of 4 rems for vertical and 0 for horizontal. Okay, that's better. Now, if we click on this button, we get this ugly blue that Chrome adds. This is called the outline. To get rid of it, we have to go to the rule for our buttons. And here we're going to set the outline to 0. Now, note that all these properties are sorted. That's why I added this property over here. Okay. Now, let's test it one more time. Good. So the outline is gone. Next, we need to add the domain prices. Now, earlier we defined a list component which can be inline, but I made a mistake there because these items are not exactly inline. If you pay close attention, you can see that they're lined up perfectly in rows and columns. If we use an inline list, depending on the width of the viewport, these items may not be lined up properly. So what layout should we use to implement this? We should use a grid. So back to our markup, after the div that represents our input group, we're going to add the list of prices. So here we add a UL and give it the class of list, so we remove the bullet points and the left padding. Okay. Now we should use the grid layout here. So I'm going to give this an extra class like domain prices. And this is an element of the domain block. So it would be better to call this block domain _ prices. So this is an element inside this block or this component. Okay. Now let's grab this and back to our style sheet. We're going to define a new rule and say this element uses a grid. So display grid. Now on mobile, we're going to have 3 columns and 2 rows. So here we need to set grid template columns to repeat 3 and 1 FR. So we're going to divide the free space into 3 fractions or 3 slices and give each column 1 slice. Okay. Then we're going to set grid template rows to repeat to 6 rem. This is for setting the height of each row. If we don't set this, our items are going to be so close. Now that we have defined a grid, let's go back to our markup and add the domain prices. So we're going to have 6 list items. So li times 6. The first one is going to be .com for $9. The second one is going to be .sg for $10. Now I'm going to pause the recording and fill up the rest. All right, our list is ready. Let's see what we get. So here's what we get. Our items are perfectly aligned. Now we need to reduce the font size and use a badge in one of these elements. So I'm going to use a badge for the first element. I'm going to wrap this with a span with a class of badge and badge _ secondary. So now we have a badge here. Perfect. Next, we need to set the font size. So back to this rule, I'm going to set the font size to 2 rems and font weight to 600. Take a look. Okay. That's pretty close to our design mockup. Now, this design mockup, you can see that these items are horizontally aligned in the center. But in our implementation, these items are left aligned. So which property should we use to set the alignment? Justify items. That is for the horizontal alignment, right? We set this to center. Good. So that is very close to our design mockup. I think the mobile version looks pretty good. Now let's look at tablets and wider screens. So on tablets, we have so much space between these elements. So we want to lay these out horizontally in one line. So we're going to define a media query. for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. In this block, we're going to define a rule for block domain prices. Now, this is the interesting part. We're going to change the template for our columns. One way to solve this problem is to use repeat 6 1FR. So we're going to divide the space into 6 fractions and give each item 1 fraction. Take a look. That looks pretty good. But what if tomorrow we decide to add one more item here or remove one of these items? Then we'll have to remember to come back here and change this number. So let me show you a cool trick. Instead of hard coding this value like 6, we can use a predefined value called auto fit. With this, the grid will try to create as many columns as needed to fit all these items. Now, if we use a fraction unit here, this is not going to work. So look, we still have 3 columns. Now, what if we change this to an absolute value like 100 pixels? Now, take a look. Let me expand this element so we see what is going on here. So here's our list. Now, if we click on this grid badge, we'll see the grid overlay. Look at the columns. We have 6 columns, and each column is 100 pixels wide. So the grid calculated the number of columns properly, but we don't want to force the width of 100 pixels to our columns. So what can we do here? Well, here we can use the min-max function to provide a range. So this function takes 2 values or 2 arguments, a minimum and a maximum. We can say our columns should be a minimum of 100 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction. So if there's extra space available, like what we have over here, that extra space will be equally distributed to these columns. Now, let me save the changes. Take a look. So we have 6 columns, and all these columns are beautifully sized. Now back to our markup. If tomorrow we decide to add another item in this list, the number and the size of columns are going to get calculated properly again. So let's remove this new item. Now back to our style sheet. So here we're using 100 pixels. We can replace this with 10 rems, which is 100 pixels as well. So we get the same result as before. Now back to our design mockup for standard screens. Look at the width of this list. This list is not taking up all the available space in the container. So here are the boundaries of our container. Our list is kind of smaller and in the middle. The same is true for this input group. So let's grab our ruler and do a quick measurement. What is the width of this list? It is just over 700 pixels. So back to the rule for domain prices. Here we're going to add another property and set max width to, let's say, 700 pixels. All right, here's what we get. So our list is not going to grow beyond 700 pixels, but we don't want this to be in the left. We want it to be in the center. How can we solve this? By setting the horizontal margin to auto. So all the available space will be equally spread to the left and right margins. So I'm going to set the margin to 0 for vertical and auto for horizontal. Now take a look. Perfect. We need to apply the same technique on this input group. So here's the rule for our input group. Earlier we set the margin to 4 rems vertical and 0 horizontal. I'm going to change this to auto and then set a max width of 670 pixels. All right, that's much better. So let's test this component one last time. Here's the mobile version where we have all these items distributed in these columns. Beautiful. Then we have the tablet version and the desktop version. Perfect. So we're done with this component. Let's move on to the next lesson.